much face the prospect that rule won't even be around in a year, and I don't think anyone would argue, I don't even think Chris would argue, that there's a likelihood that Congress will respond by putting it back. The second thing we want, which in some ways is a little bit of tension with the first, is really big networks. And the interesting fact here, and this is just a fact, but it's a really important fact that nobody seems to want to articulate, which is for the first time since the beginning of the commercial internet, we do not have a national wireline provider who has articulated plans and publicly announced plans to Wall Street to build a network better than the current best available network. That's a really big fact. Here's what that fact means. It means that in somewhere between 3 and 5 years, the best network available to most Americans is the network they have today. That's a really big fact. That's not going to be true in a lot of other places. So as you think about those two facts, then you might think, well, how do we articulate something? Following up on Susan's thing, which, by the way, I agree with in part and disagree with in part, but always enjoy listening to her speak and very much look forward to reading her book. The question is, how do you articulate the problems created by these two facts in a way that drives action, in a way that makes it manifest in the world? I would suggest to you that one thing we ought to articulate is that the country needs a strategic bandwidth advantage. Why? Because bandwidth is a critical input to the economy. We are replacing atomic inputs with bits, chips, and bandwidth. And if you go back to the history of human civilization, 5,000 years ago, we replaced human labor with animal labor. We saw a big increase in the ability to thrive as a species. A couple hundred years ago, we started replacing animal labor with steam engines and other sources of power. We started to replace modes of transportation, traditional modes of walking and animal with other modes, canals, railroads, etc. 100 years ago, we did another replacement in terms of electricity and transportation. When you have these replacements of input, you get huge economic growth. And the combination of that change of input plus the ability to do combinatorial innovation, which is critical to increasing productivity, that's what happens on broadband. That's why bandwidth is a critical input to that. So the country, I think we could articulate that we need a strategic bandwidth advantage, and the market isn't going to provide one. I might add that not only do we have no incumbents talking about building a better network, what are they talking about? They're talking about data caps. Now, by the way, if I were running those companies, that's exactly what I'd be talking about, and I'm not suggesting a policy to prevent them from doing that. I am saying that goes to a second thing we ought to articulate, which is that the country needs a psychology of abundance, not a psychology of scarcity. When I was at the FCC the first time, we made some mistakes, but two things we did well was we didn't allow the bell companies to impose permanent access charges on internet traffic, and as a result, American consumers became the biggest users of the internet, and that led to a lot of very positive things for both the internet economy and the American economy. Similarly, when we reduced in what was exactly not understood by anyone except my boss, Reed Hunt, when we reduced wireless to wired terminating access charges, we led to a huge increase in wireless usage around 96, 97. AT&T announced the one-rate plan. Suddenly, a lot of things happened. It's interesting that Randall Stephenson recently said he really regrets the unlimited data plans. And by the way, I think it probably was a mistake for the company, but it was really great for the country. It's why we have the apps economy, $40 billion, I think, and about a half a million jobs. It was mistakes like that led to it. So I think it's important to articulate that psychology of abundance. So that leads us to today's panel, because if you think about how do we get a strategic bandwidth advantage and how do we get a psychology of abundance, what's most important is to have replicable sustainable models that actually do that, prove it can work. And when we started looking at that in terms of one of the things we articulated in the plan was how do we get a critical mass of communities that are utilizing world-leading networks where they have a bandwidth advantage, where they have an abundance of, where they have abundance in terms of bandwidth. And the place that had it the most and did it the best, of course, was the universities. And actually, it was Lev Gonick's beta block in Case Western that really inspired some thinking, not enough thinking, I might add, and that was my fault in the plan. But after the plan finished, we kept thinking about it, and this is what led to the GigU project, where we announced the first gigabit deployment in Orono, Maine a couple weeks ago. Wednesday, stay tuned, we'll be announcing something even more significant. But with that, I just want to say that whether it be what Geoff is doing in Lafayette or Mike is doing in Indiana, or Levin and his colleagues in Ohio, these are folks who are giving us replicable, sustainable models by which we can develop that strategic bandwidth advantage, which I think even conservatives in this country would agree we need to somehow produce. And with that, let me turn it back over to you, David, or turn it over to Lev, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Blair. Let's get right to it, and let's invite the audience not to experience the post-lunch letdown, and invite you to be part of the conversation. Join us whenever you'd like to. I'm going to just start right away. Pankaj, Blair basically said even conservatives are going to be able to get on this train. You run the Ohio Academic Research Network in Ohio. Governor Kasich, Republican of Republicans, has made a $12 million investment in what it is that you're doing. What is it that you're doing, and how did you get a Republican governor to actually not only come behind it, but to actually take some ownership of it?
Well, thank you, Lev, and Blair, thanks for setting this up. So, you know, I get to be the face to answer that question, but it's been a lot of people behind the scenes who have tried to transform this situation. So let's just go back a little bit in history. I've worked with Lev and 3 other leaders in the state to go after the BTOP awards. We finished that. We had a good second round with $150 million to get the middle miles done. The new administration comes in and we show everything's done. The interesting thing that really helped us, and all through the morning, this is my, by the way, first meeting here, and I'm tremendously thankful. It was a lot of learning for me in the morning. But the perspective that I'm coming with is we had to work with the private sector to make that first piece happen. And I think as the new administration took over, looking at that public-private partnership where the last mile and the middle miles are basically run by them, but in conjunction with the backbone that we have in Ohio, very rich backbone, going up to 100 gig soon with the 12 million influx. That was the turning point, to bring them into the situation, showing them the value. And it's very difficult to show just the scientific and innovation value. But when we were able to construct the economic development piece out of it, with manufacturing and healthcare being 2 of the engines, along with analytics and other pieces, bringing the universities together, bringing the workforce development together, that was a very appealing thing for them.
Great, we're going to just do a couple of quick round fires here to kind of establish the what. So you've heard from Pankaj, basically running this academic backbone, but now actually through BTOP, actually connecting many middle mile anchor institutions, now partnering with the private sector to actually bring together at really unprecedented. This conversation in Ohio has not been about megabits to gigabits. It's from gigabits to 100 gig. That's the conversation that Pankaj is leaving right now. And that's really about connecting all the universities, schools, libraries, government facilities, and the like, all that middle mile access. So that's the what in Ohio, thanks to Pankaj's leadership. Mike, over to you guys. Talk a little bit about what the what is that you're involved in, because Pankaj is trying to do this statewide. You're trying to do this, you are doing this actually with BTOP funding in multiple communities.
Yes. The Urbana-Champaign Big Broadband Project is actually a consortium of the city of Champaign, the city of Urbana, and the University of Illinois. If you think of a donut, Champaign is about 2/3 of the donut, Urbana is 1/3 of the donut, and the university sits in the whole of the donut. So we together, banded together, formed a consortium to go after BTOP funding. Our project is very different from all the other BTOP projects. We have both a middle mile component and a last mile component. We're building rings throughout the community as I speak. Roughly going to serve somewhere in the 200 to 300 anchor institutions. We also have a last mile component where we're going by roughly 5,000 predominantly low-income homes with a fiber to the home ploy. We've got about enough money to do about half of those homes. The thing that was unique about what we proposed was we looked at anchor institutions, and the NTIA had a list of what they considered an anchor institution, but the ARRA legislation also said organizations that serve vulnerable populations. So we sat and thought, well, what's a vulnerable population? Well, very young people are vulnerable, very old people are vulnerable, disabled people are vulnerable, homeless people are vulnerable. The list kind of went on. And so in an area that's roughly 50 square miles with 150,000 people in it, we may have upwards of 300 anchor institutions by the time we're all done. I brought some maps and lists up here, up on the stage if you want to see kind of what we're doing. But we got battered women's shelters. We just did a whole variety of smaller organizations. A lot of black churches were interested in getting connected and using this new network in a way to reach out to their parishioners. So those are the broad strokes. We'll come back for other things.
Great, thanks, Mike. So again, you've got one project that's statewide, working at 100 gig, leveraging the BTOP dollars plus state money. You've got Mike going to town in a model, which I'm going to invite him to talk about a little bit later, in terms of once you built it, turns out the university's turning this big project over, and we want you to talk about kind of what comes next a little bit later. That's certainly a very, very big deal. And then, Geoff, do you want to sort of talk about your work and FiberCore's work to mobilize Lafayette, Louisiana?
Yeah, absolutely. First off, no federal dollars, all entrepreneurially done. I wanted to also go ahead and thank Mr. David Eisenberg. I was lucky enough to be able to co-produce an event called FiberFed a couple of years ago that was served as a key catalyst for Lafayette in terms of the story I'm about to tell. So, David, thank you very much. And I want to kind of put a charge out to the audience here as well. We come to these events quite frequently, and we have a great time. We get a chance to talk, explore a lot of different ideas. But let's make sure we think about how do we take the energy from this event and turn it into a catalyst for action coming out of the event. Hopefully our story can help inspire some of that as well. So FiberCore is the nonprofit that I run in Lafayette. I actually was a DCite as well, and I was radicalized by my experience. I like that. I like Susan's word on that, where I kind of was involved in broadband policy for a bit and felt like I need to get out in the real world and try to go get some good stuff done out there as well. So FiberCore is an organization that the community created. 6 community organizations came together: the city government, the Chamber of Commerce, the Economic Development Authority, the university, the Community Foundation, and a 3D visualization facility in our community, specifically to drive digital economic development. So how we got this network, now what do we do with it? That's my personal passion. We've got all this bandwidth, now what? How do we actually improve healthcare, improve education? There's a lot of rhetoric about what fiber can do, but the reality isn't necessarily as good as the rhetoric is at this point in time. And in large part, it's because you need to have a lot of concerted effort around getting these projects from concept to reality. It's not a minor thing to be able to pull that off. And so what we're doing is developing a community engagement model around supporting that kind of innovation for how do you have a community scale living lab kind of environment for next generation technologies. In particular, we developed a model that starts with events. From events, we identify pilots. From pilots, we form coalitions. And from coalitions, we then conduct outreach to be able to add additional resources into the process. We've done this in healthcare over the last 18 months. We had an event called Camp Fiber for Healthcare 18 months ago. We identified our first couple of pilot projects. One was making Lafayette a pilot site for the State Health Information Exchange effort, something I consider to be a cornerstone for next generation healthcare. Second one was our telemedicine bridge project. That was a project where the largest manufacturer of jewelry in the country, it's based in Lafayette, 2 weeks ago went live with a telemedicine clinic in their offices. They got 1,200 employees within one office building. They have 3 or 4 layers of security because you have to literally get the gold dust vacuumed off of you. So going to see a doctor is a significant challenge. And then we were able to form coalitions around those pilots, including the Lafayette Healthcare Coalition, which is the 3 biggest hospitals in the community and the 3 biggest private healthcare providers, all of which are national level healthcare providers headquartered in Lafayette, all wanting to be able to collaborate and be able to work together on these kinds of projects. We're now working on beginning to conduct some outreach to be able to tell our story.
As soon as you said we're beginning to, I'm going to hold that one for the next question. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay. Just want to make sure then that sort of we level set. We've got a statewide project that's going on. We've got a multi-community project, and then you've got Geoff driving a nonprofit strategy. I just want to share with you that in Cleveland at Case Western Reserve University, our work kind of runs the last part of this, which is the university itself is engaged actually, as Blair indicated, in essentially creating a test bed for a series of ways of actually marrying community need in inner city Cleveland with the research activities of a great research university, which is something this country still enjoys, is great research universities. I think that they might well be at risk if we don't actually figure a way to actually marry directly to the community's direct needs. And so we did pilot the first research program in the country by connecting 100 homes symmetrically at gigabit speeds and turning that into a research project. The first PhD was just actually given yesterday at Case. He finishes his dissertation actually on taking a look at, from an engineering perspective, some of that work. 2 MA theses were actually finished this year, again, on how people are actually consuming that resource, consuming that bandwidth. And then in the activities, again, in addition to providing a very micro kind of version of what Blair and his team are leading for GigU, we also very much focusing in on trying to stimulate from the research community and from the entrepreneurial community around us the development of gigabit apps. I mean, we're building these networks, 100 gigs, 1+ gig directly into a jewelry factory. What are we actually going to do to begin consuming those resources? And again, the university has kind of stimulated a conversation and some experimentation and 3 guys in a garage stories to actually maybe provide a microcosm of what UIUCNet aspires to be in terms of those activities, and is partnering with organizations like the Mozilla Foundation, and Will Barkus is in the audience today. Will's going to be leading the Mozilla Foundation Gig Apps. He's their evangelist, and that's huge for the university to actually be engaged in using the students, using the faculty, using the postdocs, and using the entrepreneurs in the community to see this sandbox as a place to do those activities. So those represent some what's in terms of what we're doing. I want to just kind of speak to, I want to ask, again, we'll go around, maybe we'll start with Mike, and we'll work our way simply down the line. Why? Like, why are we doing this? In addition to being successful with BTOP money, I mean, why in the donut of Champaign Urbana, are you guys engaged in this activity? And is there a story worth telling there that helps us frame this? Maybe it helps us with the Susan Crawford challenge of trying to create a compelling reason for this kind of effort.
Well, the short answer is it's the right thing to do, but the much longer version, I had to go to the cities, and we have an Urbana City Council person here, so I have to be careful what I say. Brandon Bowersox is with us. The city of Urbana,
he's tweeting and doing a good job of it, by the way.
The city of Urbana is politically more liberal than the city of Champaign. I think that's a fair thing to say. I sometimes call them communists, whereas the city of Champaign was kind of a prototype for the Tea Party sometimes. So it gives you an idea of the spectrum between the two. The only message that resonated with both city councils on a consistent basis when I was proposing this and getting them to fund it and so forth was economic development. That's one thing that no matter where you are politically, that makes sense. And that was the why.
All right, so you've heard it once. You're about to hear it multiple times. Geoff.
Well, the Lafayette story, Lafayette's actually understood the value of infrastructure for over 100 years. 100 years ago, they decided they wanted electricity. They were the same size as all the little towns around them. Went to the big guys. Big guys said, wait your turn. They said, screw you, we're building it ourselves. They're now 2 or 3 times bigger than all the other cities around them as a result of that infrastructure. 100 years later, the exact same thing happened. Only because of the visionary leaders that we had, they understood, our Mayor Joey Durrell says it quite eloquently, they didn't build fiber for cheaper cable TV. They did it because of this opportunity to become a test bed for next generation applications, to be a place where it's economic development, it's also community development. The idea of improving your healthcare, your education, things like that. For me personally, I really feel like I'm a big believer in fiber and what that means for our infrastructure, what that means for our international competitiveness as a country. And the thing that I felt like we were really missing was we don't have any great shining cities on the hill. We do have some great communities that have done really great networks, but how many communities do we have that you can point to and say, look what they're doing with that network. Look how they've totally changed how healthcare works in the community, totally changed how education works in that community. And so I felt like we really needed to be able to have a community, and Lafayette, in my assessment when I went around the country, was best positioned to be able to do that.
Great. So Pankaj, over to you. I mean, your vision is from Rust Belt to Tech Belt. So what's that mean in terms of motivation?
Sure. Few drivers. Definitely, as you said, Case Western leading the effort in that first round. I see we had to work with 2 forces. The first was academics and research. And clearly we had that vision going in, and then a buy-in from the biggest one, which is Ohio State University, was very critical. From their perspective, it was imperative that just not themselves, but the rest of the universities around should also be at that category of higher bandwidth. So just to add some icing on the cake, in the last round when we got the remaining $3 million to upgrade the network, we were also able to convince that we should get all the Ohio universities up to at least a gig. And so we are not able to pay for all of that or subsidize, but work with the private carriers to kind of put in some percentage of the monies. So that was one driver to bring it up. And that way the academics can talk to each other in the state. Virtualized labs is the next big feature. We are testing that out within OARnet and between the universities, and the data that's going to come out of there. Long-term, experiments with the Hadron Collider and the data coming in was another driver. But I think by far the largest, again, the driver that we heard here is the economic development and job creation. Adding jobs that have been lost, at 30,000, 35,000 a year is not appealing anymore. And when people look at the statistics and say, if you can get that innovation and the research and develop the workforce at that level, then that's called true economic development and job creation. That's what the motivation is for the state.
So I guess I would just say that from Case Western Reserve's perspective, while we're a great research university, we live in one of America's poorest cities. 7% of the kids actually graduate from high school. Should I say that again? In terms of the long-term synergy, the long-term symbiotic relationship between the university and the community around us, if we're not actually trying to attend to education, and in particular in Cleveland, given the role of institutions like the Cleveland Clinic, creating a workforce that can actually work in healthcare, in the healthcare systems, that is actually not attending directly to the healthcare needs of the community. And obviously, and significantly here, is attending to the economic development potential of the communities immediately around the university. So the motivation from the university's perspective has been fundamentally to try to attend to not a binary choice of there's a town-gown separation, but rather how do we create an and both scenario where we attend to the priorities of the community around us and both turn those into opportunities for research, for direct experiential learning, for actually creating partnerships that are sustainable and meaningful in the long run, and that ultimately can be replicated and scaled at other universities around the country. Because I think, without even Blair being here, just to finish that obvious point, this is about replication and scale to take advantage of a strategic bandwidth requirement that is actually, again, meaningful to the immediate communities around many, many of our research universities, which don't look that much different than Cleveland and Case Western Reserve. So the last round of quick round fire, and folks, we're leaving by design, lots of feedback, and we're trying to, I've asked my colleagues here to be provocative, not that you would have guessed that yet, but it is actually to obviously invite the feedback so that we don't necessarily have to deal with some of the drivel that's coming from outside on the Twitter feed, although we know who the internal people are here, and we're happy to deal with all of your comments, but some of the silliness from the outside that we were talking about earlier, we welcome you formulating and provoking us back and pushing back. And so, again, we've heard about a national vision, a statewide vision, a multi-community vision, a community basically mobilizing itself to actually position itself for the next 100 years, as if I can put the Jeff Dailey story into perspective here, and then a university trying to remain relevant and engaged with the community around us. There's four kind of use cases for why big bandwidth matters. And by the way, folks, we have a collective challenge. The challenge is what to call it. Dial-up, okay, we understood what that is. Broadband, we understood what that is, but what comes after broadband? That's what we're talking about here. And we really need to be thinking about what to call it, because it's not only a matter of coining it, of branding it, it's really about positioning what it is that we're working on together here. And we can certainly take that one up over drinks later this afternoon or tonight. But let's just go, Geoff, start with you. What's happening next? I cut you off a couple minutes ago. What's the next 12 months look like in terms of your engagement? And if you want to sort of summarize that piece, just to leave some things open for our audience here to respond to, and then I'll ask Pankaj and then Mike to finish that up.
Absolutely. So one of the things we're doing is going to be trying to build on the momentum that was created. We had an event called the Cajun Code Fest 3 weeks ago, a very successful coding competition where we had a number of VIPs from out of town come to Lafayette, in particular because they were inspired by our story about what we were doing in healthcare. The biggest one of which was Todd Park, the Chief Technology Officer of the United States. He put out a tweet that we really enjoyed. It was, Lafayette is the best kept secret reservoir of innovation mojo in the United States. and that got retweeted by the White House. So he's rather excited about what's happening. So how do we keep leveraging that energy? And in particular, what we're doing is working to establish ourselves as a living lab for health innovation and be able to build up the social infrastructure, the research infrastructure, and the technical infrastructure in order for that to be a sustained multi-year initiative so that all the world's innovators who are doing next generation healthcare technology have a place that they can come and test those technologies in a community scale environment. We're also going to be starting in the fall the process that I talked about for how we kind of turned on the healthcare industry. We're going to do the same thing in the education industry. Have a camp fiber for education, find initial few pilots, build coalitions around them, and then conduct outreach. And then we're very much looking forward to, I assume we'll talk a bit about the UIUCNet program and what that can mean in terms of a coordinated national effort to say, hey, there's great stuff going on in all these communities. How do we do a better job of leveraging each other and leveraging the best practices that are learned in each community and applying them so that the things we learn in our community we can share with these other communities in the room and on stage, and vice versa. We can learn from other communities and apply those lessons within our city as well.
Great, Susan, that was an invitation for you to share a little bit of what you're doing in Oakland and everybody else who's been chatting in between. Mike, what's happening in the next 12 to 18 beyond kind of getting the trenches finally fully filled with fiber and connected to their endpoints?
The main thing on our mind right now is finishing our grant. Our deadline is January 31st. We have no customers turned on today, and by then we'll have 2,700 customers turned up. The trenches are pretty well dug, almost all the conduits in the ground. They're pulling fiber now. The first customers will go on in July. But what's happening is our rings go everywhere throughout the community because the anchor institutions are everywhere throughout the community. But the fiber to the home section is very compacted in one section of town, roughly 10% of our population. We get calls all the time. You guys just put fiber down my street. How soon can I get it? We get calls from businesses. We have businesses that are looking at grouping together and paying for their own laterals so they can get connected. The communities that are outside of Champaign-Urbana in Champaign County want us to expand out to them. We haven't turned on a single customer yet, but it's like an infection that is taken over. Everybody wants fiber, and that's wonderful. So we are part of GigU, and we're looking forward to maybe a solution coming from GigU that will give us a vehicle to do the other 90% of the community. So even though we're still up to our necks in building, we're also kind of now turning some of our focus to what happens next.
Right.
And that would be next summer.
Pankaj.
So our immediate next 6 months to 9 months is putting the equipment and lighting the 100 gig backbone, which is in 2 phases. I have maps later on, you can have them. So that should be done hopefully within 6 to 9 months. But beyond that, we've also looked at and seen what's the use case, and especially on the side of the universities, which is our anchor tenants, to build upon what you said. We are creating what's called an innovation center using the 100 gig technology. We are looking at a few verticals, starting with networking and virtualization and healthcare. Those were the 2 components that are ready to go in some aspects, so we're going to build upon that. And this virtual lab is going to be very much working in conjunction with private sector. Our goal is to take the problems that the private sector has in terms of products, in terms of services that need to be implemented. Like you and I talked earlier, how can you get those flows beyond 300 megs? If you even have a 100 gig backbone, what are you going to do about it? Mm-hmm. So those are the kinds of problems that we are planning to attack using this. Connecting ourselves to the internet to backbone. Just 2 weeks ago when this Rust Belt to digital belt and to the innovation belt was announced by Dr. Whitaker, who is the Chief Research Officer at OSU. The idea behind that was that 3 universities in Ohio out of the 7 in the country, we are going to take the leadership role into defining 100 gig backbone, into going with the science DMZ on the campuses so that the scientists have a way to tread the networks, and then the software defined networking. So I'm getting a little geekish here, but that's the concept on as to what we are going to do with the 100 gig and not just open up the pipes.
Great, and again, I'll just sort of share, 8 years ago, Case Western Reserve partnered to create an organization which perhaps some, if not all of you, know about, which is called One Community. One Community was the partner that Pankaj referred to in terms of our middle mile contribution in Northeast Ohio. One of the things that the university, who's provided a lot of the talent, the young talent, that's been working with One Community in one of its BTOP funds is actually around digital literacy, and has just completed 25,000 households in Northeast Ohio, run in partnership with the Cleveland Housing Network, a public housing network facility, to actually put forward a full curriculum for bringing inner city, largely inner city, not only inner city, but also rural, immediate rural communities around us through a formal curriculum program that is being completed. In addition to the curriculum, those folks actually receive refurbished computers that is part of what One Community has organized in a recycling program with the corporate sector in the greater Cleveland area, as well as very inexpensive, as in $10 a month, broadband connectivity that is all part of what One Community is engaged in. So big shout out to what One Community has done to attend to another huge need in the community, and that program is completing its work. Alongside of some of the things that folks have mentioned here, I'll just share with you that in addition to the first research program that perhaps provided a small spark of inspiration for the launch of GigU that Blair obviously is leading and referred to, we are also now working with faculty in our School of Medicine, also working in the healthcare space that Geoff refers to, and we'll be connecting the first research program in the country connected at symmetrical gig into 136 senior citizens residences to really extend the question, how do we disrupt the way healthcare is delivered to seniors in terms of their wellness? So we're measuring wellness outcomes. And we're also taking a look at the cost model. Can we change the cost model for the delivery of healthcare to seniors by leveraging not only the big pipes, again, looking for what we call it, because it's way more than broadband, because we'll have a debate forever if we're trying to talk about what broadband is from megabits to gigabits. Right? That's just a total time sink. We better figure out what the new language is from gigabits to 100 gig kinds of words, right? And in that context, working with a whole bunch of great technology partners, some of whom are in the room, to really begin to model how we can apply those to the condition of an aging society in the Cleveland area, and again across the nation, something that we think is replicable and scalable. And again, hoping that this stimulates part of what UIUCNet is after, which is obviously to try to focus in on the opportunity to create next generation applications. I'll go back to one of Blair's opening comments, which is the psychology of scarcity versus the psychology of abundance. And the challenge to the developer community is to move from a reality which has conditioned their psychology of scarce bandwidth to one in which there is effectively no constraint that we can currently quantify. And if we think about what is possible in terms of the evolving and emerging immersive experience, which is where this connectivity is taking us into a fully interactive immersive experience, we think that that has huge, huge provocative, disruptive, and hopefully life-altering changes for senior citizens and the rest of the population alike. So those are the things that we're working on right now. We have a little bit of funding from the NSF that we were successful in getting to actually build out a platform for this immersive, I'm calling it right now GNets, but it could be anything else you want to call it, but this next generation of network connectivity that is focusing in on interactive immersive experiences. So I happen to have some more questions for the crowd here, but we wanted to certainly invite folks to chime in, and we'll start just so that we can deal with the audience that's actually online as well as the one that's here. Maybe you'll introduce yourself for a second and ask your question or make your comment.
Right. Okay, so Harold Feld with Public Knowledge. I wanted to ask, from the perspective of somebody who's been involved in advocacy around these issues, what can be done to make it easier for you guys to tell your stories and to collect them and repeat them over and over and over again? Because as all of you guys can attest to, and as others can attest to, there is a lot of very good and very interesting stuff going on here. But it is very difficult in Washington, D.C. to break through the noise, and in state capitals, as we have seen, where legislation has been moving to curtail the ability of states or localities to experiment. Part of what drives that is you have a very sophisticated noise machine on one side that is pushing certain kinds of messages, and it's been difficult to counter. I do want to, by the way, single out a couple of people like Chris Mitchell who have done an amazing job of trying to document what's going on and the successes in the field. But from the perspective of people who are, kind of head down trying to deploy this stuff, concerned with making it work, much less than, putting together 15 different types of glossy, packets for different occasions. What could help in terms of being able to get the story out more?
Thanks, Harold. Mike, first?
I'm going to steal a little from Geoff. Our project, we have some ways we think we want to measure success, and I don't know we've really zeroed in on all those, but there's projects out there already that are starting to show. Lafayette, I believe that parish has got the single highest growth rate of any parish within the state of Louisiana. The county that Chattanooga is in is growing economically and growing population-wise, whereas the rest of the state isn't. Those are things that legislatures listen to. And I've just got anecdotal evidence, but sooner or later this all needs to be accumulated. And I think the Fiber to the Home Council does a certain amount of that, but you have to belong to get all of their information. But that's important. The areas that have got fiber to the home have grown, and the areas that don't are not necessarily growing, or worse, they're getting smaller.
Geoff, a couple key messages? Yeah, well, one thing is we as a community, as Lafayette, haven't done a good enough job telling our story, and I think that's true of a lot of the communities. We need to do a better job of stepping up our game so that we can equip you guys with the stories to be able to go out and share them in that way. It's also not necessarily an easy challenge because, we talk a lot about economic development being a key driver of this, but how much was the fiber responsible for that economic growth? Generally speaking, the fiber was a component. It's not the be-all and end-all of it. And unpacking that is a significant challenge, especially the way that we judge economic development, which is why I would suggest that I think one of the biggest things we could do is try to define one of the phrases that hits home for me is the idea of a digital economy. And really start defining what does a digital economy look like, contrasting it against our more traditional manufacturing-based economy. And within that context, you can start doing things like looking at fiber as the printing press of our digital economy and talking about what that means. Right, because people understand the printing press and how significant that was in that way. And there's clear ways you can talk about having all this bandwidth is going to enable all this economic growth in these digital economy kinds of worlds, whether it's application development, video production, interactive kinds of experiences, services that are delivered over these networks in that way. So creating an intellectual framework around what it is that we're doing from a large, not just the community level, but from the national level, and the significance of continuing this growth, I think would be a very significant thing. Pankaj.
Yeah, and so just 2 weeks ago, again, as we are unveiling this program, I have been inundated personally and as an organization on getting all these materials that we've put together, starting with educating the legislators as well as the governor's office and the Board of Regents. So all of that, Dan here is there from West Virginia, there you go. And he uses it all the time, and so do other friends. So I've had at least 7 or 8 states request us. We do have a group of research and education networks, the Quilt as well as Internet too. So there's a forum through which we distribute that material. But anybody who is interested in looking at everything that we've done, from glossies to PowerPoints that help you build the case, making it happen. And then definitely we are looking at collecting, just like you said, the use cases that have actually come up. So just an example or two which prepped us to do this. There's a manufacturing company close to where Lev is wanting to talk to Procter & Gamble because they are in their supply chain. They need to transfer a file of 35 to 50 gig on a daily basis on computations that they do. They use FedEx. Good case for us to build upon, right?
So again, I just want another shout out to, again, most everyone in this audience will know Jim Balor. Nobody's thought more about the economic development message challenge than Jim has. I think that one of the big things is to go back to Susan's comments just before lunch, which is we've got to stop talking to each other. So Harold, I think the point is, we've got to find others to line up in our coalition of the willing, acknowledging that there's a very large and noisy coalition of the unwilling that you were referring to. And I think a big shout out to Pankaj, because, and I opened by making sure that you understood that Pankaj has pulled off something quite remarkable. A Republican governor has committed public funds. We were up for sale. But now committing public funds to actually invest in creating a competitive advantage, or to use Blair's terms, a strategic bandwidth advantage. And he's focused, and he can talk the talk. It's a lot, in many audiences, that's a whole lot better than us talking the talk.
Hi, I'm Joe Plotkin. I'm marketing guy. I'm Joe Plotkin.
New York Wireless.
NYC Wireless, and also unemployed marketing guy, so if anybody needs some visibility help. I'm obviously wildly impressed with all the efforts that have been going on, and in terms of publicizing or finding emergent applications, to what extent are these communities working together to try and publicize and have more applications emerge? It seems like you collectively are one giant Uber gigabit testbed. Uber bandwidth, whatever.
Do you want to take this as an opportunity to talk a little bit more about?
Yeah, sure. At this point, not enough is the answer. We're all, just like the deployment of fiber, where it's a lot of reinventing the wheel and everyone kind of doing their own thing and there's not enough collaboration going on. The same is true on the utilization innovation side of the equation as well. I'm very hopeful, though, because I think with initiatives like Blair's GigU, the UIUCNet initiative as well, the White House and National Science Foundation effort to create a national network of testbed communities to specifically encourage that collaboration, I'm very hopeful that I think we're going to see more of that, because the reality is this is not a zero-sum game. It's not that one of us can be the test bed and no one else can. We're really going to all need to be test beds, because we all have particular strengths and weaknesses as communities. And so lessons that can be learned in Lafayette, we've got a unique group of assets that we have that are different from Chattanooga, that are different from Case Western. And if we can find a way to be sharing those best practices, I'm very hopeful that we're going to see a lot more of that happening in the coming months. And really, maybe even weeks.
Indeed.
Hello, Isaac Wilder, Free Network Foundation. I think the technological aspects are interesting and applications are interesting, but I wonder if you could speak to governance and the public interest is at stake here. So what mechanisms have you put in place to ensure that these networks are actually used to benefit the constituents?
So, Mike, I said a little while ago that I was going to give you a chance, and this is the best one I got so far, to actually speak about your model, as you guys have gone from essentially build to creating a governance model for operate, and maybe share that, and then we'll go down the line. Geoff's basically given you a bit of the answer, which is it's a 501c3, but he can go another riff on that, and obviously, we asked the Ohio guys to maybe say a word or two, but we'll keep getting input. Keep throwing things at us. Go right ahead, Mike.
UC2B is currently an intergovernmental consortium, which was a good thing. We could do it quickly. We could apply for the grant. We had something official. An intergovernmental consortium is maybe not the optimal way to run a business. So we're actually looking at different forms of governance. But in terms of making it relevant and making sure that it serves the needs of our community, we were headed towards an open access network long before NTIA said we had to do an open access network. And we've actually taken it a step further now. We're actually mandating open access for our laterals in a dark fiber sense. If you're a private provider and you want to connect to one of our rings, we're forcing you to turn that lateral fiber over to us, and we will then operate it in an open access capacity. If somebody else comes along and wants to use that lateral that you built, you're going to get some of your money back from the people that come on top of that, but we want to own all the infrastructure. We want all that to be one commonly managed infrastructure for both lit services and for dark fiber services.
On the network side of the equation, it's public utility. So from that perspective, it's always going to be tied into the community's needs. But the point I wanted to be able to make, though, was one I'd mentioned when I talked about building up the infrastructure of a living lab, the idea of social infrastructure. And I think that's the thing that too often we miss. We take this if you build it, they will come mentality, put in place the infrastructure, and innovation magically happens. My argument, though, is that most of the technologies that take advantage of these networks require us to address the social infrastructure of how our communities operate. In other words, changing individuals' behaviors, changing the relationships between organizations. And if you're not able to really tackle that part of it, then something like a health information exchange is a perfect example. Because if you don't have healthcare providers willing to share data with each other, it's not going anywhere. It's not going to be able to happen and really move forward. That's why we chose to make FiberCore do it from a nonprofit perspective, because we want to be able to serve as a fair broker, a convener within the community. Because if the person trying to pull people together is trying to make a profit out of it, you're not going to have that same level of trust. Whereas if you can have a nonprofit that's focused on these issues and is representative of the community, then you can have a chance to really get that feedback loop going, where the work that you're doing to maximize the utilization of the network directly aligns with the needs of the community.
So our situation is complex in terms of governance, as you can imagine, serving all the anchor tenants from education, research, innovation, state government, public broadcasting stations, and healthcare on the backbone. Our whole purpose is to aggregate all this demand together. That's the reason for need of 100 gigs. And then governed by the stakeholders. So the network piece of it is governed. We have the state CIO, the governor's office, along with the CIOs from the universities. And then on the supercomputing side, which is kind of the application, we have both publics, privates, and not-for-profits on them. So that really brings together the governance. And clearly, we see that as things shift, I mean, even right now we talk about there will be shifts in governance, because as the stakeholders change, we need to engage different kinds of folks on because of the buy-in. That's exactly what we've been able to do. So it's a complex process.
The last word I'll just say is that I'm not going to represent the university's piece of it. It's fairly obvious, I think, to all how the university more or less governs itself, or if it's opaque. Join the rest of us, we're not quite sure exactly how governance works at the universities. But the point I want to share is that there's also another whole part of this next generation of networks in terms of governance, and that would be sort of, that is what the gig.u process hopes to catalyze, which is private sector engagement and private sector governance and partnerships in private-public partnerships. So there's a whole nother set of activities that are actually, you know, Maine being sort of the first example of a private-public partnership. It kind of builds on the story just before, again, 2 sessions ago, where we heard about things going on in the East Bay. I mean, those are already activities where you're getting kind of blended, but with a bias towards the private sector kinds of interests with respect to how governance might work. Let's go right ahead. Who are you, by the way?
Hello, I'm David Eisenberg. I run a small meeting in Washington, D.C. every year. First of all, my hat is off to you guys for pursuing your vision in a very goal-directed way, and I love it. Second, I think that I'm a little uncomfortable that you're going after the benefits of ultra broadband or super broadband or giga blah 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 in a linear way that may the fact is we don't know how broadband, the benefits of this ultra broadband stuff accrue. It's really early in the game. What we do know is that people want it. Here's a Gedonken experiment, an armchair experiment that I did when I was back at AT&T, and the very first local area networks were being deployed. And remember secretaries? The secretaries worked in one common office, and they got this experimental music application that people in Bell Labs had put together, and they were listening to it over their local area network, and they really liked it, and then they would occasionally flash a print job over to the printer, and it would get there like that and print and stuff like that. But if you had deployed an efficiency expert who counted up the number of seconds or minutes saved by the secretaries in doing their normal job, that efficiency expert would have said, pull the plug, go back to floppy disks and dial up. They're saving like 6 seconds a week or something, you know, who knows what it is. But the fact is, if you had pulled the plug, they all would have gone on strike or quit or something. That they really, really liked it. I don't know why, but I like it too. so there are these nonlinear effects.
Got it.
There are a lot of reasons why this is important, and you're pursuing a set of very linear goals. So it just makes me uncomfortable.
We like your discomfort, David, because you'll keep us honest on it. And I think all of us to varying degrees have been involved in testbed activities. Let's assume those test beds are consistent with the kind of multi-directional sort of discovery path. But at the same time, because this panel that you created was largely about accountability for public funding in our environments, we are actually obligated to actually report exactly what we're doing in a way that may seem like we know exactly what we're doing, because there are outcome measures that we're being held accountable for. But I think your point's well taken.
Thank you. Judy Clark, Many Media. I'm going to talk about almost at Geoff's speed and give you two quick stories.
Almost impossible, but go right ahead, Julie.
I know, high aspiration. These are two quick stories that we use at Litze and Leandro to talk about how to understand the nature of this new connectivity that we're bringing. One is Beijing. Beijing has the leading genomic lab, and one genome for one person before it's been processed is about 100 gigs. After it's been processed is easily 300 gigs for the processed file, and then they summarize it so that they can send it over bandwidth. When Beijing needs to send files, they send hard disks. That's true. The second story is back in the days when there wasn't electricity, then there became electricity, and it wasn't evenly distributed, and some of the communities got electricity, and they developed better, faster, cooler things, and now we couldn't imagine having a plug in our house that doesn't have something in it or overloaded with something's in it. So the concept that we have broadband now, which is the new electricity, and we might want to get a gig today, or we might want a gig, tomorrow, the next day, 10 gigs, 100 gigs. We can't imagine what we'll have in the future that will be too many of them, although we have a sense of it right now with too many devices for the amount of broadband in the limited sense of the word that we have today. So I just wanted to offer those two stories.
Those are great stories.
Well, I guess I'm going to, Mike Wiseman from Seattle, and I guess I'm going to offer a couple of stories, but also an observation of the discussion I'm hearing. One story, several years ago, I was asked by a community up in the San Juan Islands here up near the Canadian border to come up and talk about an institutional network and what that would mean for the community. Now, they have fiber coming up to the island. And this is an island that probably has about 25,000 people living on it. But they have fiber coming up to the island because the University of Washington has a research station on the island, and so they had pulled fiber up there years ago. A filmmaker in Seattle approached me and wanted to put an office on that island. They do animation. They wanted to put an office on that island, and they could have moved 10 or 12 jobs up there, and these would be high-paid family jobs up to that island if the community would bring fiber, allow him to tap into the fiber so that he could move his files, as we've heard today, these large files that they need to move back and forth during the day or every night. Couldn't do it. The cable provider, Time Warner, said, if you hook up anybody outside the University of Washington, we will pull cable off the island. Okay? So folks were freaked out that they wouldn't be able to get their ESPN, so that was the end of that story. I think we need to, another story is, we have fiber in Seattle, but it runs down two main streets in the center of the city. There are loads of entrepreneurs in the city that would love to be able to put their offices in some of the areas, of the city where office space is quite a bit cheaper. But they can't, because they can't get fiber in those neighborhoods. So my point is this. As I'm listening to the conversation today, and we're so excited, what you have is enlightened CTOs, enlightened COOs, a few enlightened folks who come together in a community in kind of the perfect storm, if you will, of brilliance and innovation and common sense to make projects happen. But what's happened in so many communities around our country is one person. Oftentimes it's the noisemakers that Harold talked about, the telecom lobby, but oftentimes it's just one bad CEO. We had a hospital that we wanted to hook up as an anchor tenant. Hospital said, fine, we'll hook up to the fiber as an anchor tenant, but no one else can be on that line. Why? Security. Okay? Now, I think you would all agree that's something that can easily be solved. But you have one unenlightened person can gum up the whole works. So what I think is so remarkable is how you've brought that together. But what I wonder is how we can replicate that confluence of individuals across the country more frequently.
Wait, I'm just about to turn the mic back over to David because we're almost out of time, but let me just use this opportunity to first thank my colleagues at the panel for joining us and to indicate that obviously all of us live and are mindful of those realities and many, many more in our community. I think what you have here is not only a confluence of circumstance, you've also got a kind of demonstration of the leadership that exists both at the state level, at the multi-community level, and right in the community here, which is in fact replicable and scalable. I think that the GigU initiative, you should talk to Blair Levin about what's going on in Seattle, because he and his colleagues, I think, are doing something that might be of significant value. It's the value of this network of people that David Eisenberg puts together, both virtually and in real time, that makes this kind of thing possible, because we are trying our best to be the coalition of the willing, knowing full well about the extent to which there's a coalition of the unwilling out there. That is what Freedom to Connect is all about, at least for me. David, over to you with 44 seconds to go.
42 seconds. And so I would like to yield the balance of our time to the esteemed Blair Levin for a closing remark.
Let's see if I can do it in 30. Two quotes, one from Alan Kay, who famously said, the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that certainly is true of what we're trying to do. He asked his students, what's the slowest speed any brain will tolerate? And they all started thinking about neuroscience. And he said, no, you idiots, that's not what I'm saying. The slowest speed anyone will tolerate is the fastest speed they've ever experienced. And I think that you just, that's the way this is going to move. Closing with a quote, when we launched in Maine, there were a lot of great speakers. By far the best was a student. You can see his video on the GigU website, who said, well, this project will bring immediate benefits to the state, listed some of them. The most exciting thing is what we don't know yet. The ability to have innovation removed as a constraint bandwidth removed as a constraint on innovation. That, what we don't know, that's the most exciting thing. And thank you all for making that future possible.
Hear, hear.